Fellow Disciples by Victor Yap and Doris Mock. Chapter 21. I know that my Redeemer lives. John chapter 20, verses 1 to 10. It's been quite a while since MH370 disappeared from thin air on March 8, 2014. Military radar tracking revealed that the Beijing-bound plane made a sharp turn over the South China Sea and changed altitude as it headed toward the Straits of Malacca. The plane was reportedly flying at 35,000 feet before it descended as low as 12,000 feet and then disappeared from radar, according to the official. The Inspector General of Malaysian Police said police were focusing on 4 possibilities over what happened: a potential hijacking, sabotage, psychological issues, or personal problems of the passengers and/or the crew. 10 planes and 9 ships searched in vain for the plane or the wreckage. The trail was cold from Malaysia to Australia, from northern to southern Indian Ocean, from radar to black box. All they found were floating objects that include a wooden pallet, a gray or green circular object, and an orange rectangular object that turned out to be old fishing equipment more than 6 feet in length. Experts said the search could take weeks, months, and years, a long time according to some. The biggest mystery in the Bible and history must be the disappearance of Jesus' body. Did the disciples hide his body? Did the ladies take it? Did robbers steal it? John's account of the resurrection is as puzzling, as personal, and passionate a story as any. There was no full proof of Jesus' resurrection, but the first-hand evidence speaks for itself. 3 of Jesus' favorite followers were there to witness the event and the evidence of the resurrection. No one witnessed the resurrection, but many were changed by it. What is the power of the resurrection? What is the purpose of the resurrection? What is the promise of the resurrection? First, hurry up and tell in love. John chapter 20, verses 1 and 2. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." A man was pulled over by a policeman and asked if he knew he was going too fast. He said, "I'm sorry, officer. I had my cruise control on and I just forgot the speed limit changed." His wife said, "Harry, I told you 2 miles ago that you were speeding." Harry gives his wife a dirty look as the officer pulls out his ticket book. "By the way, sir, did you know that your left rear signal lens was broken?" the policeman asks, to which Harry replies, "Oh, wow. It must have just happened in the mall parking lot we just left." His wife again interrupts and says, "Harry, how can you sit there and lie to that nice policeman? I told you to fix that 3 weeks ago." Harry gives another look that could kill as the officer starts writing. The policeman adds, "I'm going to have to cite you for not wearing your seat belt also." Harry says, "I just unbuckled as you came up to the car so I could get to my driver's license if you needed it." The little lady pipes up, "Harry, you know good and well. I tell you all the time that you better buckle up 'cause you never wear your seatbelt." Having taken all he can stand, Harry turns to his tormentor and says with great exasperation, "Woman, would you keep your big mouth shut?" Now the officer looks at and addresses the little lady and asks, "Does he verbally abuse you like this often, ma'am?" Says she, "Oh no, only when he has had 1 drink too many." One of the pointed differences between Christianity and other religions is that the biggest credit and highest accolade in the most important event in church and world history were bestowed upon ladies. The bravest disciple of Jesus on Resurrection Day were women, not men. They were the finest, fairest, and fittest disciples. Luke's Gospel tells us that at least 4 women were present at the tomb: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James and others, Luke 24:10. Matthew and Mark were unanimous, saying in 4 Greek words, all the disciples deserted him, fled. Matthew 26:56 and Mark 14:50. Unlike the men, the ladies never deserted Christ. They watched Jesus from a distance, or makrothên, Mark 15:40, but they never disappeared from sight, ran for their lives, or denied him when questioned. The women were unflagging in caring for and looking after the needs of Jesus and the disciples before, Mark 15:41, and after his death. Unlike Peter, who followed at a distance, Luke 22:54, and denied him 3 times, the women followed him, mourned and wailed for him, Luke 23:27. They were with Jesus before, during, and after. Such were the passion and perseverance of women for the Lord. Luke's Gospel informs readers that the women took the spices and perfumes, or ointments, they had prepared, Luke 23:56 and 24:1, and then went to the tomb, Luke 24:1. Mary Magdalene had more reasons than most to serve the Lord in life and death. Jesus had cast out 7 demons from her, Luke 8:2. Like other women, she was consistent, committed, considerate, courageous, and conscientious. Table illustration. The priests described as the rulers and the fearful ones. The ladies described as the returnees and the feeble ones. The apostles described as the runaways and the fragile ones. These women had a story to tell, discovering the empty tomb, but unfortunately the men did not believe them, Luke 24:11, because their words seemed to them like nonsense, or leros, or idle tale, King James Version, a woman's tale, or a fishy story. What motivated the ladies? Matthew noted that the angel proclaimed the good news of Jesus' resurrection with 4 imperatives: do not be afraid, come, see, and finally tell. Matthew 28:5-7. The last imperative, tell, echoed by Mark 16:7. Following that, Mary ran, or treko in Greek, Matthew 28:8. The same running Mary did in verse 2, John 22, and added the adverb hurried or quickly, or tachu. Jerusalem, with its many hills, was not ideal or meant for runners, men or women, especially the latter. A Jerusalem runner said, "You cannot run 5 minutes without finding yourself climbing up another hill or flying down one." Wonderfully, the resurrection is the only reason a woman in the New Testament ran, Matthew 28:8 and John 22. Matthew recorded more than one Mary ran, Matthew 28:8, Mary Magdalene, and the other Mary. They responded strongly, swiftly, and speedily. There was not a moment too soon and no time to waste. Mary Magdalene was the first to be credited with seeing Jesus, or rather, Jesus revealed himself to her. Her courage outfought the fear of facing the guard who was posted at the door. The day after Christ was crucified, the chief priests and the Pharisees convinced Pilate to secure the tomb area until the 3rd day for fear that the disciples would come and steal the body and tell the people that he was resurrected, to which Pilate responded with two imperatives: go and secure the tomb by putting a seal on the stone with a guard at hand. Matthew 27:62-66. Soldiers were plural. Matthew chapter 28, verse 2. Second, hurry up and think with hope. John chapter 20, verses 3-7. So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Luke 24:12. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. The vice principal of a South Korean high school, who accompanied hundreds of pupils on a ferry that capsized, had committed suicide, police said, as hopes faded after 3 days of finding any of the 274 missing alive. The Sewol, carrying 476 passengers and crew, capsized on Wednesday on a journey from the port of Incheon to the southern holiday island of Jeju. Kang Ming-yu, 52, had been missing since Thursday. He appeared to have hanged himself with his belt from a tree outside a gym in the port city of Jindo, where relatives of the people missing on the ship, mostly children from the school, were gathered. Police said Kang did not leave a suicide note and that they had started looking for him after he was reported missing by a fellow teacher. He was rescued from the ferry after it capsized. Hope is at its most valuable in the face of death, devastation, disaster, and despair. Hope changes our act, our attitude, and aim in life. It did not matter who ran fast or who ran last, John or Peter, but both kept chase. Peter and John ran to the tomb to see for themselves and to corroborate Mary's testimony. Running requires energy, endurance, and equipment. Peter was not much of a runner, sprinter, or athlete because John outran him to reach the tomb. Some suggested John was obviously younger than Peter, not only because the book of John was written about 30 years later than the other Gospels, but also because John ran faster, leaving Peter in the dust. Peter, on the other hand, was more adventurous and ambitious than John. He went into the tomb to explore and examine the evidence for himself. Peter was not fit in running, but fine in thinking. Peter wanted untouched and uncompromised evidence to deliberate, deduce, and decide things for himself. He was more curious than cynical, more direct than doubtful, and more involved than indifferent. It was a redemption of some sort for him. The verb went into the tomb in verse 6 is a contrast to his previous decision to follow Jesus from a distance. Matthew 26:58, Mark 14:54, and Luke 22:54. The previous Peter, unlike the women who followed Jesus to the cross, followed Jesus to the courtyard only. John 18:15. Peter prefers to investigate rather than be informed. John's account is important because he is the only insider piecing together the internal evidence from the tomb. Overall, these 5 pieces of evidences would decide Jesus' resurrection: the stone, the seal, the soldiers, the spices, and the scene of the sepulchre or tomb. The first 3 in one verse includes the seal, the stone, and the soldiers. Matthew 27:66. Mark noted that the stone was very large, Mark 16:4. The fourth, according to John 19:39, was about 75 pounds of spices in NIV or 100 pounds in King James Version, wrapped around Jesus' body. Finally, the climax of the scene, or the sepulchre, that were the final and most important piece of evidence, the strips of linen, plural, lying on the floor, and the burial cloth, singular, from Jesus' head, that was curiously wrapped or folded, verse 7, the same word for the way Joseph of Arimathea wrapped his body, Matthew 27:59 and Luke 23:53. With these 5 pieces of evidence, it is not too difficult to determine the chances of the ladies, the disciples, and even thieves from stealing the body. First, the ladies were too limited in strength. It was not an ordinary stone, but a big stone in front of the entrance of the tomb, Matthew 27:60. Second, the disciples were too cowardly to act. Third, the robbers were unlikely to unwrap the body for fear of bad odor. Also, men would hardly bother to separate linens from cloth, nor are they that neat. Warren Wiersbe says, in fact, with the presence of the spices in the folds of the clothes, it would be almost impossible to unwrap a corpse without damaging the wrappings. The only way those linen clothes could have been left in that condition would be if Jesus passed through them as he arose from the dead. The transformed Peter from the timid Peter we know was the most powerful evidence of the resurrection's impact. The verb see, theoreo, in verse 6 is also translated as perceive, observe, and consider. Merriam-Webster defines a theory as an idea that is suggested or presented as possibly true, but that is not known or proven to be true. It is not conclusive, but it is convincing and credible. Peter was convinced and not cautious, careful or curious anymore. He was confident and not clueless. There was controversy, but it was not contradictory. In the end, it kept Peter thinking more like wondering. Luke 24:12, which is also translated as astonished, Matthew 8:10, amazed, Matthew 8:27, awe, Matthew 9:8, surprise, Mark 15:44, and marvel, Luke 2:33 in the NIV. Third, hurry up and triumph in faith. John chapter 20 verses 8 to 10. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. The renowned infidel Robert G. Ingersoll, 1833 to 1899, also nicknamed as the Great Agnostic, was renowned for his attacks on Christianity. His lectures against Christ and the Bible and his oratorical ability usually assured him of a large crowd. At the height of Ingersoll's fame, audiences would pay $1 or more to hear him speak, a giant sum for his day. One night, after an inflammatory speech in which he severely attacked man's faith in the Savior, he dramatically took out his watch and said, "I'll give God a chance to prove that he exists and is almighty. I challenge him to strike me dead within 5 minutes." First, there was silence. Then people became uneasy. Some left the hall, unable to take the nervous strain of the occasion, and one woman fainted. At the end of the allotted time, the atheist exclaimed derisively, See, there is no God. I am still very much alive. After the lecture, a young fellow said to a Christian lady, "Well, Ingersoll certainly proved something tonight." Her reply was memorable. "Yes, he did," she said. "He proved God isn't taking orders from atheists." The conclusion, verse 8 on, was remarkable because Peter's truth, verses 6 and 7, and John's trust, verse 8, triumph over the testimony of the ladies, fact and faith over feelings. John was a model of a disciple. He was a sacrificial, sensitive, and steadfast, never selfish, sour, or scared. At the cross, he was the only apostle who stood by Jesus and stood with the ladies. John 19:26. At the tomb, he waited for Peter to catch up, allowed him the next move, gave him the chance and space to decide. Some believe that Peter and John were rivals for Jesus' affection because of Peter's famous reference to John. "Lord, what about him?" John 21:21. John's insistent on calling himself in his gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved. John 13:23, 22, 21:7, and 20 did not erase or lessen the suspicion. The credit to John, however, was not how fast he ran, but how firm he believed, not how speedy he was, but how sure he was. John was first to arrive, last to enter, but quick to believe. The difference between John and Peter at this point is that both saw, but one believed. The writer of the gospel. John's gospel repeats the verb believe as many as 6 times in the chapter, verse 8, 25, 29, and 31, including ending with twice the last verse of the book. Believe is the most glaring verb in the book, found 11 times in Matthew, 14 times in Mark, and 9 times in Luke, but 98 times in John. John was the first apostle to believe him in the post-resurrection era. John's faith was not based on emotions, but on evidence, not on feelings, but on facts, not on sensation, but with substantiation. Peter and John were 2 sides of the resurrection story. The former was driven by guilt, but the latter by grace. One was fearless in belief, the other had faith to believe. Peter was filled with thoughts, but John was full of trust. One rushed to enter, the other reached a conclusion. The 2 men's path to faith was legitimate. Verse 10 is a conclusion and a unity statement. The disciples, plural, went away, plural, to their, plural, homes. Conclusion. The crucifixion means rebellion, regret, rebuke, resentment, revulsion, but the resurrection means redemption, restoration, reversal, reconciliation, and renewal. Christ has conquered sin, death, and Satan. Are you walking in newness of life? Romans 6:4, and bringing forth fruit unto God, Romans 7:4. Are you living in the past or present? Do you trust in the truth of the resurrection, the testimony of the scriptures, and the transformation power of God? Bible study questions. 1. According to this passage, who was the first to arrive at the tomb? When did the person come? What did he discover? Verses 1 to 2. 2. What was the response of Simon Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved after hearing what Mary Magdalene said? Verses 2 to 3. 3. What did the two disciples find? What did the discovery mean? Verses 4 to 7. 4. According to the passage, who was the first to believe? Did he believe that Jesus had resurrected? Verses 2, 4, and 8. 5. Why must Jesus rise from the dead? Application: Personal Devotional Reflections. 1. How can we experience today the shock Mary Magdalene, Peter, or John felt upon finding the empty tomb? Try to put yourself as one of them in their roles and share your thoughts. 2. After seeing the empty tomb, how did Mary Magdalene, Peter, or John in faith accept the reality of the Lord's resurrection? 3. In the present age, is believing in Jesus' resurrection difficult? Why? 4. How do we explain the evidence of Jesus' resurrection to non-Christians? Is the resurrection of Jesus important in salvation? Encourage participants to read some books on apologetics regarding the evidence of the resurrection, such as Who Moved the Stone, or Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Small group members can share their findings on the evidence for the resurrection. 5. What is the biggest shock of the Lord's resurrection to your thinking or feelings? After each study, always encourage members to share one lesson learned about being Jesus' disciple or one act to practice as his disciple.